If you've ever felt uneasy in your own home, hearing creaks in the ceiling or finding something out of place, you already know the dread the Gruber family lived with. The only difference? For them, the fear wasn't imagined. It was real. And in Bavaria, between March 31st and April 1st, 1922, that quiet unease ended in 6 brutal murders. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll reconstruct the days and the evidence that made Hinterkaifeck so uncanny, piecing together the strange details that still trouble investigators a century later. To begin, we need to look at the farmhouse itself, a place where silence carried heavier weight than sound. In the spring of 1922, Bavaria was still recovering from the shadow of war. About 70 kilometers north of Munich, the hamlet of Grobern stood quietly, its scattered homes forming a small rural community. Just beyond its edge, set between thick woodland and open fields, stood Hinterkaifeck, an isolated farmstead that had long drawn wary glances. Though not miles from its neighbors, it was separated by several hundred meters of uneven ground, enough distance to feel apart, enough silence to seem forgotten. The farmhouse itself was a sturdy structure, practical and self-sufficient. No electric light reached its rooms, and investigators decades later would note that searches of the property relied on daylight, lanterns, and matches. At night, the farm sat in near total darkness, the tree line looming like a wall. Even the smallest sound became pronounced, a branch snapping, a door hinge shifting. And without another household in earshot, these noises carried their own unsettled weight. That atmosphere of seclusion shaped how the community viewed the Grubers. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children lived together in the house. They were not embraced as friendly neighbors. Rather, rumors surrounded them. One reason was impossible to ignore. In 1915, Andreas and Victoria had been convicted of incest. Andreas was sentenced to a year in prison, Victoria to 1 month. The scandal never left local memory, and even years later it fueled suspicion and distrust. For villagers who depended on clear reputations and mutual reliance, the Grubers seemed marked. The result was a household standing apart in more than geography. People often remarked that the family kept to themselves. Their farm produced well enough, but they offered little warmth in return. At markets or chance meetings, their exchanges were formal and strained. Silence filled what should have been ordinary conversation, leaving room for others to fill in the blanks. In small communities, news traveled slowly, often warped by the retelling. Odd behavior, however minor, left impressions that lingered. Stories collected around Hinterkaifeck faster than they might anywhere else, because distance and reputation made the family feel less like participants in village life, and more like figures observed from outside. This is why Hinterkaifeck's isolation mattered so much. In places where neighbors lived wall to wall, an unexplained sound or a misgreeting would be quickly clarified. But here, days could pass without anyone catching sight of the Grubers. When absence or strangeness arose, it rarely had an immediate explanation. That void was filled with rumor. A comment about Andreas seeming irritable could become, by the 3rd repetition, a story of violence. A quiet week at the farm could become an air of secrecy. Slowly, visitors too felt something was off. Travelers remarked the property seemed strangely muted, as if disconnected from the usual rhythms of rural life. This impression fed into the growing image of the farm as withdrawn, almost insular. Over time, each retold story seemed to confirm the last, and the silence surrounding Hinterkaifeck came to feel like part of its identity. For many in Grobern, the farm was not just another homestead, it was regarded as unsettling, a place apart. Life inside did carry on with its expected chores. Livestock needed tending, fields required labor, and firewood had to be cut. Yet this routine unfolded behind walls that few outsiders ever entered. Accounts from villagers describe tension within the family, quarrels, grudges, uncertainty about who controlled decisions. Each of these details was small in isolation, but together they reinforced the image of a household cloistered and uneasy. The farm stood at a remove, not only in space, but in mood, private, strained, and heavy with unspoken matters. When the shocking events of early April 1922 finally came, they did not appear out of nowhere. The farmhouse already had an aura of unease. Neighbors had long been primed to expect oddities, so even ordinary mishaps were remembered as warnings. Years later, when asked to recall what they noticed, villagers produced not a single turning point but a chain of impressions. Subtle sounds, brief silences, fleeting suspicions. The sense of foreboding was not concentrated in one event, but stretched across many. This is why, when unusual signs began appearing around the farm, they carried such weight. By then, Hinterkaifeck was already seen as a place where the normal rules of neighborly life didn't quite apply. Whispers had shaped its reputation into something ominous. And when one morning revealed a set of strange tracks pressed into snow, the unease that surrounded the farm suddenly became something that could be seen with the eyes, rather than just felt in the air. Imagine stepping into the cold morning air, expecting nothing more unusual than another day of chores, and instead finding a line of footprints etched cleanly into the snow. The steps came from the direction of the forest and led straight across the yard toward the outbuildings of Hinterkaifeck. They ended at the machine house, near a door where the lock had been damaged, and no second trail marked a return. Why would tracks lead in and not out? That question, once raised, could not easily be set aside. For Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the farm, this was not an idle curiosity. He examined the prints and knew they weren't the half-formed shapes of animals or thawing snow. They were boot marks, exact enough that when officials later documented the clues, they were recorded in statements with little dispute. The absence of tracks leaving the property suggested something unsettling. Someone had drawn close to the farm deliberately, and then either disappeared inside the buildings or found a way to slip back into the woods unseen. The footprints suggested an outsider had come near and then vanished, or remained concealed where no one could find them. What made the moment heavier was that Andreas did not keep it to himself. He told neighbors what he had seen. They remembered the story later, and it carried weight precisely because it had been discussed at the time. Yet for all the unease those steps caused, there was no official report. According to accounts, Gruber declined to involve police. When a neighbor even offered him a firearm for protection, he refused. The reasoning behind those choices is lost, but the result was simple. No evidence was secured, no investigation began, and the snow soon melted, taking the clearest trail with it. Inside the farmhouse, Andreas searched for answers on his own. He moved from room to room, opening cupboards, looking under beds, checking hidden corners where a person might hide. Nothing showed signs of intrusion. Tools and possessions seemed untouched. Nothing appeared missing, and no one stood waiting in the shadows. For most people, that absence of proof would lessen concern. For Andreas, it was the opposite. The lock on the machine shed had clearly been tampered with, and the steps leading up to it became harder to ignore. If there was no one inside the house, then where had the visitor gone? At the time, neighbors did not respond with alarm. Within small farming communities, strange sights were often explained away. A drifter could wander through the countryside without leaving a trace. Mischievous travelers could test doors or explore sheds. Others were content to believe the story was no more than superstition, and life moved forward. Still, the image... From our perspective now, the silence surrounding those prints seems striking. If someone truly had approached the Gruber farm in the days before the murders, this may have been the earliest concrete sign. Was that person inside the machine shed even as Andreas searched the living quarters? Had they already mapped out the property, patient and hidden, testing how far they could intrude without being challenged? The footprints, so clear in their direction yet so incomplete in their ending, hinted at possibilities that villagers at the time may not have wanted to confront. Nothing was stolen. No violence followed immediately, and the visible threat seemed to evaporate as quickly as the snow around the impressions. The family continued their routine, but the fact of the intrusion lingered. For Andreas especially, who had found the tampered lock with his own hands, that image must have been difficult to dismiss. To walk again across that same yard, retracing the route of those steps, meant remembering each time who, or what, had stood there before. The moment has since become one of the most important details in reconstructions of the case. Investigators referred back to it, treating it as one of the few pieces of evidence that came directly from the family before the tragedy. Even with records missing and suspects debated for decades, this point, strange tracks leading to the farm and a damaged lock, has been consistently repeated. It remains neither explained nor disproved, resting instead as a fragment of certainty within a story otherwise shaped by rumor. Seen alongside the Gruber's isolation, the footprints marked a turning point. Whispers and suspicions had always hovered over the family, but those had been intangible, fed by gossip and distance. Here was something physical in the snow, undeniable to anyone who looked directly at it. Once evidence is so plain, silence becomes harder to justify. And yet silence was what followed. That gap between knowledge and action would grow even more troubling in the days that remained. It is also telling how the steps implied stealth. In rural Bavaria at that time, visitors did not arrive quietly. Travelers walked the main path or came by cart, visible long before they reached a home. To move instead through the woods and approach the farmstead, without announcement, carried a different intent. It suggested caution, purpose, and someone unwilling to be seen. The tracks in the snow were not polite arrival. They were secrecy written into the ground. Looking back, one unanswered question has shaped how the public imagines Hinterkaifeck. Was the stranger already inside, watching from some hidden place? Or had they abandoned the attempt and left unnoticed? Even without a clear answer, the idea of a presence that could slip in without alarm made it harder for the family to feel secure. The walls may have looked firm, the fields wide and open, but the snow showed otherwise, that their world could be breached. In the weeks and years after, neighbors recalled these moments as warnings missed. Andreas had shared the discovery, but without action, the chance to find an intruder or trace their path was lost. The footprints dissolved with changing weather, and no further signs were found outside. Yet, inside the farmhouse, another source of unease soon grew louder, a sound that could not be erased so easily as melting snow. It came not from the yard, but from above their heads. What unsettled the Gruber family most were the noises that seemed to come from above. Soft but deliberate, as though someone was moving across the beams of the attic. This was not a fleeting impression or the creak of timber on a cold night. It was heard more than once, a pattern that turned simple curiosity into a source of constant unease. The detail that made it harder to dismiss was Andreas Gruber's response. He did not laugh off the sounds or treat them as imagination. He went up to check, lantern in hand, searching the rafters, and every time he returned finding no one. The attic itself was hardly welcoming. It was dark, unheated, and served for keeping tools or hay rather than for living space. Still, it was large enough to provide concealment. Cats and birds sometimes slipped into such gaps, scratching or fluttering to produce noises easily mistaken for footsteps. But Andreas himself began telling others he was hearing not animals, but a person, or something beyond that. Neighbors later recalled he even suggested the farm might be haunted. Coming from a farmer known for his sternness, that admission showed how persistent the disturbances had become. Superstition colored many explanations in rural Bavaria at the time. Whistling winds through loose boards, shifting beams and flickering lamps could all be interpreted as signs of restless spirits. Yet what the Grubers described was not vague unease. It was the sound of weight moving across timber, too measured to be dismissed as random. Anyone who has sat in an old house knows the difference between settling wood and paced steps. The family came to recognize that difference, hearing the attic as an occupied space even if they could never put eyes on its occupant. Months before the murders, their unease had already produced consequences. A maid employed at the house left abruptly, saying she could no longer tolerate the sense of haunting within its walls. This was not taken as proof of anything concrete, but it added to the perception that Hinterkaifeck was a troubled home. That a worker gave up steady employment in such uncertain times should have deepened the concern. Instead, it was absorbed into local gossip, another detail folded into the farm's reputation for strangeness. The later investigation forced attention back to those attic sounds. When police examined the loft after the murders, they noted 2 hollows pressed into the hay, as if someone had used the soft piles as a makeshift bed. More troubling still, human excrement was found on the hay, clear evidence that a body had spent time living there. Investigators also discovered 2 roof tiles deliberately shifted aside. From those gaps, an observer in the loft could look directly into the yard below. These physical traces gave weight to what had before been only uneasy testimony. Taken together, the noises, the hollows, the shifted tiles, and even the waste on the hay supported the hypothesis that someone may have occupied the attic in secret. It was an idea never proved beyond doubt, but one that fit both the family's memories and the later evidence on the scene. If true, it meant the Grubers had not imagined a haunting. They had been sharing their roof with an intruder. Such a person could have descended for food or drink and climbed back undetected, watching the family's movements through the gaps in the roof. Payas, this possibility reframes the months before the murder as a long period of observation. Someone who lived in the attic was not simply trespassing. They were studying the rhythms of the household, learning its habits and silences. The shuffling noise in the rafters, which Andreas had listened to with irritation and suspicion, may have been the sound of that surveillance. An unseen figure, patient enough to remain hidden, was waiting while listening to daily life unfold beneath him. For the family, the explanations available at the time did little to ease fear. They could suspect animals, or imagination, or superstition, but none of these held up when the noises returned again and again. Every evening in the farmhouse bore the risk of those sounds starting up once more. And each time, Andreas took his lantern up the steps into the loft, knowing he might find someone crouched behind a pile of hay. He must have felt the tension sharpen. What is most striking in hindsight is that the Grubers had both warning signs and corroboration. A member of the household staff had left rather than endure it. Neighbors were told of Andreas's suspicions. Footprints had been found leading into the outbuildings, with no trace of exit. And eventually, investigators uncovered signs of a hidden occupant. All of these pieces now sit side by side in the record, though at the time, they were scattered impressions. No one gathered them together into one undeniable conclusion until after the crime was done. That failure to connect the details left the family carrying their dread alone. Daylight work masked it, and routines pressed forward, but at night, the creak of wood overhead could turn a moment of rest into a reminder that something or someone was unsettled above them. They were not only battling gossip from the villagers, they were battling the instincts provoked in their own home. This made the arrival of new help on the farm all the more charged. The decision of one maid to leave had become a small story in the village, but another woman eventually agreed to take her place. She would enter the farmhouse at the end of March 1922, stepping into a household already shadowed by fear. Her presence should have brought relief. Months before tragedy struck, one of the Gruber's servants had already chosen to leave. In the autumn of 1921, their maid abruptly quit her position, not over wages or disputes, but because she insisted the farmhouse was haunted. She told others she heard footsteps in the attic at night, deliberate movements overhead that she could not explain. In an era when rural communities balanced faith, tradition, and superstition, this explanation was not taken lightly. To villagers already wary of the family, a worker abandoning a steady post only confirmed that something was deeply wrong at Hinterkaifeck. Her departure added another thread to the farm's reputation, an impression that isolation, secrecy, and unease clung to its walls. Leader needs back to Farmhouse of Souls. The Grubers had to manage for months without a replacement. That meant the burden of cleaning, cooking, and tending the rhythm of the household fell entirely on family members, in addition to their farm work. While manageable, the absence of a servant widened the sense of separation from the rest of the community. Maids did more than complete chores. They moved between households, brought bits of conversation from the outside world, and offered a link across the silence of the fields. Without one, the household felt more sealed off. Go for to third, explained body. By March 1922, the family sought help again and hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old, hoping to secure steady work in difficult times. On the afternoon of March 31st, around 4:30 p.m., she arrived at the farm accompanied by her sister. Maria's sister escorted her to the house, stayed briefly, and then left her to settle in for her first day of service. That farewell moment gained significance later, when it became clear Maria's sister was likely the last outsider to see the Grubers alive. Started, why? B.I. Mooring, a freeware mind. What Maria stepped into was not an ordinary household. She entered a farm already carrying stories of attic noises, tampered locks, and whispered fears. Whether the family chose to speak of these things to her directly is not recorded, but the farm's reputation was known locally. Even so, Maria began work without hesitation. She was there to help, and a new position meant stability. Darity a crosspull all of the coring going to its strings, and find always Maid done. The tragedy is sharpened by what investigators later found. Among the possessions recovered from the farmhouse was Maria's suitcase, resting on the bed in the maid's room. It was still packed, unopened from the journey. She had not lasted long enough to put her things away. A detail so simple, underscores both the swiftness of events and the abrupt end of her life. She arrived prepared to work, but never even had the chance to make the room her own.
Maria's fate created an unsettling link between the past and present of the farmhouse. The maid who left in 1921 had saved herself by trusting her dread. Months later, Maria arrived to replace her, only to fall victim within hours. Together, these two stories bracket the period of mounting fear inside Hinterkaifeck. One woman turned away before it overcame her, the other was pulled into it at the very threshold. Her arrival also raised questions about timing. Did she happen to step into a household where violence was already planned? Or was her presence, an outsider entering the circle of the family, the trigger that set events into motion? We cannot know for certain. But the sequence is undeniable. Her sister guided her to the farmhouse that afternoon, and by the next day, silence had settled over the property. Maria's position in the story carries weight for another reason. Unlike the Grubers, she had no history connected to disputes, scandals, or resentments. She arrived without baggage, simply as an employee. That makes her death harder to explain through theories of family conflict alone. If the slaying was rooted in hostility toward Andreas or undercurrents in the household, why include an uninvolved newcomer? Her death suggests something broader, that the threat at Hinterkaifeck did not discriminate between members of the family and outsiders. Anyone inside the farmhouse was in danger. For the family, hiring Maria represented an attempt to restore normalcy, to bring routine back into a household stretched thin by work and mounting suspicions. For the wider community, her sudden disappearance deepened the shock of what came after. News that the Grubers were dead could perhaps be attributed, in village minds, to grudges or hidden quarrels. But the murder of Maria, a stranger who had only just arrived, turned the narrative from private feud to something more sinister. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, Maria's presence anchored the final hours before the murders. Her sister's visit offered a precise reference point in the late afternoon. Her unopened suitcase showed how quickly her service had been cut short, and her position as the last to join the household emphasized how complete the destruction of Hinterkaifeck became. Every person inside on that last night perished. Aajek. The story of the two maids therefore becomes a lens through which the farmhouse's dread is measured. One sensed enough unease to walk away, the other walked in and did not leave again. Both decisions are remembered not only for the women themselves, but for what they revealed about the atmosphere of the farm. If one life was spared by distance, another was taken by closeness, and together they reinforce the sense of inevitability that surrounds the case. Maria's death made the gossip about noises, footsteps, and hauntings impossible to dismiss. Those rumors may have begun as little more than muttered talk in the village, but they ended with an empty, packed suitcase and a worker who never even reached her second dawn in the farmhouse. The balance had shifted. What was once speculation had become unambiguous violence. That closing of possibilities, when whispers hardened into fact, set the stage for what followed. The neighbors noticed nothing unusual from their homes, just a few hundred meters away. Livestock still stirred in the stalls, smoke may even have risen from the chimney, and yet inside, 6 lives had ended. How could something so brutal unfold in silence, with no cry of warning heard across the fields? That question has haunted the case ever since. The events of March 31st into April 1st, 1922, came to be known as the Night of Silence. What happened inside Hinterkaifeck was pieced together from the positions of the bodies, the wounds they bore, and the few physical traces left behind. Investigators believed the killings unfolded in stages, beginning in the barn and finishing inside the house. 6 victims died across those spaces,
Yet not a single neighbor reported hearing cries or struggles that night. The barn served as the opening site of violence. 4 members of the family, Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia Jr., were found there. Their bodies had been stacked one on top of another and covered loosely with hay and boards. The order of their deaths could only be speculated upon, but the grouping suggested they had been killed one by one, each drawn away from the house under different pretenses. Investigators thought disturbances with the animals might have been used to lure them into the barn, yet sound tests later showed that screams from the barn could not be heard clearly in the living quarters, leaving questions about this theory still unresolved. Quote, "The physical details of the killings added further weight. The suspected weapon was a mattock, or grub axe, belonging to the family. It had a distinctive screw protruding from the head and was later recovered hidden beneath floorboards during the demolition of the farm in 1923. At the time of the murders, however, it was not found, adding to the mystery of how the killer controlled both the victims and the scene. The bodies in the barn displayed deep head wounds, consistent with the weapon's blade, and investigators noted the strikes were forceful but precise. Quote, "Among the 4 barn victims, the suffering of the youngest weighed heavily in the record. The child, Cecilia Jr., did not die instantly. Medical examination indicated she lived for several hours after receiving the fatal blows. In that time, she tore out tufts of her own hair, in pain and fear, which police later found clenched in her hands. That grim detail underscored the cruelty of the night, a slow dying that revealed both terror and awareness." Quote, "After the barn deaths, attention turned back into the farmhouse. Inside, 2 more victims were discovered. Joseph, the youngest at only 2 years old, was killed in his crib. He appeared to have been struck as he slept, never leaving the bed. In the maid's room, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived only that afternoon, was found lying in her clothes, with her suitcase still unopened beside her. The speed of her death was emphasized by that small fact. She simply had not. The sequence suggested efficiency, as though the killer moved purposefully through familiar spaces. By the time authorities encountered the scene, it appeared not only as a place of murder, but of occupation. Evidence indicated the perpetrator remained at Hinterkaifeck for several days after the killings. The cows had been milked, the chickens fed, and meals were taken from the kitchen. A neighbor remembered seeing smoke from the chimney during this period, assuming life inside continued as normal. In reality, every member of the household lay dead, and an unknown person carried on their daily chores without interruption. This continuation after the crime disturbed investigators most.
To perform tasks like milking requires practice and calm presence. The fact the animals were cared for without fuss suggested the individual was not out of place. Familiarity with the layout of the farm, knowledge of how to move through it quietly, and composure in dealing with livestock all painted the image of someone who either knew the family or at least knew rural work intimately. Even the dogs appeared to have raised no alarm that carried beyond the yard.
The silence of that night and the days that followed reflected more than coincidence. To draw each victim to the barn without resistance required a patient strategy. Whoever did it understood how the Grubers lived and how to win their trust long enough to isolate them. Once inside, the sudden strike ended each life, but no sound signaled the danger to the others. Investigators returned to this question repeatedly. How could 6 deaths occur and the pattern still be controlled so completely? Later examinations contrasted Hinterkaifeck with other violent crimes. Typically, murderers fled quickly, driven by panic or fear of discovery. Here, the opposite occurred. The killer lingered, using the farm as a temporary residence. The image that emerged was not of random violence, but of deliberate takeover. For days, the property remained outwardly unchanged to the outside world. Inside, the murders had transformed it into a stage of control and possession. This behavior shaped how investigators interpreted the crime. It suggested planning rather than impulse. It also left traces that would affect the case's legacy: meals eaten, animals tended, smoke rising, and bodies hidden, but not buried. By the time neighbors became concerned about the family's absence, several days had already passed. The window for securing evidence had narrowed, and the first impressions of the scene had already been altered by the killer's continued presence.
Those lost days carried consequences. When officials finally stepped onto the farm, they were not entering a sealed environment, but one already disturbed, both by the murderer's stay and by neighbors moving about as they tried to piece together what had happened. The handling of what followed, autopsies conducted in unsuitable conditions, contaminated evidence, and missed opportunities, only compounded the initial delay. The night itself remains chilling to consider. When the bodies at Hinterkaifeck were finally uncovered on April 4th, 1922, they had lain untouched for 4 days. During that time, no one secured the property. Wind, animals, and curious neighbors altered the site before police even arrived. Crows pecked at the barn, cats wandered freely, and weather began erasing traces. What investigators met was not a scene preserved in time, but one already disturbed. And that first delay shaped everything that followed. The detectives assigned were from Schrobenhausen, a small-town force, trained for local disputes rather than major crimes. Forensic practices were developing across Europe by this period. Fingerprinting in particular was becoming standard in cities, but none were applied here. Fingerprint collection, though available in 1922, was not performed. No impressions were lifted from tools, doors, or locks. That single omission erased one of the clearest ways to tie physical evidence to a suspect. The treatment of the victims deepened the problems. Rather than transporting the bodies to a facility, autopsies were carried out in the barn itself. A makeshift table was set up, and the task fell to Dr. Johann Ohlmüller of Munich, a physician with little specialization in forensic pathology. The environment was unhygienic. Villagers were nearby, and tools were rudimentary. Records show broad notes on wounds, but few precise measurements. Potentially useful samples were never preserved. The process left investigators with only fragmentary medical evidence, far below what was needed for a crime of this complexity. Adding to the confusion, the victims' severed heads were removed and sent to Munich for further study. Ultimately, those skulls became entangled in an unusual episode when they were used in an attempted seance, an outlandish move that underscored the desperation surrounding the case. The skulls were later lost altogether during the Second World War, leaving nothing of them today. That chain of custody, from crude autopsies to a sensational seance, left the forensic record both unreliable and incomplete. Meanwhile, the property itself never achieved the controlled attention it required. Villagers who had joined the search walked through the barn and into rooms of the house before police had secured them. Relatives sifted through possessions, onlookers touched doors and windows, and soil outside was trampled. Each step destroyed fragile traces, fibers, hairs, subtle prints that might otherwise have been recorded. At a time when every clue was essential, the scene quickly became chaotic. The search for the murder weapon provides perhaps the clearest symbol of missteps. Investigators knew from wounds that a bladed farm tool was likely used. A mattock, a heavy tool for digging and cutting, was suspected. Yet thorough searches of the house, barn, and attic produced nothing. For months, the weapon seemed to have vanished. The reality was far more damning. Less than a year later, when the farmstead was demolished in 1923, the mattock was found hidden under floorboards, along with a pocket knife. Both had been within the structure all along, overlooked by earlier police teams. The demolition not only revealed how incomplete the original search had been, but also destroyed whatever residual trace evidence remained inside the building. Taken together, the failures formed a pattern of lost opportunities. No fingerprints to compare, no precise wound analysis, villagers contaminating the floor and rooms, the murder weapon left undiscovered until the property was already gone. Each mistake widened the gap between the crime itself and any chance of solving it. The record that remained was patchwork, broad details without the supporting evidence needed to reach definite conclusions. Some of the errors reflected the broader climate of 1922 Germany. Rural police worked with limited resources under conditions of post-war hardship and inflation. They were not equipped for large-scale murder investigations. To some extent, the shortcomings can be explained by lack of training and infrastructure, but the consequences were real. Each procedural misstep closed off lines of inquiry forever. Once the crime scene was contaminated, once the bodies were handled crudely, once the site was torn down, nothing later investigators could do would recover what had vanished. Even so, police pressed forward with interviews and questioning. They examined neighbors, mapped disputes, and considered motives. Suspicions ran wide, but without forensic confirmation, every lead collapsed back into rumor. The case grew dependent on testimonial contradictions, hearsay, and speculation. Years later, officials would admit that no solid evidence had ever tied any person directly to Hinterkaifeck. The oddness of the investigation has left its own mark on history. People recall not only the violence, but also the peculiar decisions: autopsies in a barn, skulls vanishing into a seance, weapons missed under floorboards. Each detail keeps alive the idea that the truth escaped not through cunning alone, but through negligence. Behind every unsolved crime lies the unknown. Here, the unknown was enlarged by human error. In modern times, the case has been revisited with sharper tools, though none can erase the early failings.
Dazu bin ich nicht auf den Strophen, dass die Sehntasichtes mit Tima zu der Säger auf den Strophen mit Tima zu oft, das will ich aus meiner Sicht zur Säglage beschäftigt ist.
In 2007, Police Academy students in Fürstenfeldbruck reviewed the surviving files, applying a contemporary eye to the record. Their final assessment criticized the lack of fingerprint collection and other omissions. They reached the view that one principal suspect stood out, but out of respect for present-day descendants, they chose not to make the name public. Even 85 years later, the weight of the first investigation shaped what could and could not be said. For researchers and the public alike, these failures laid the basis for Hinterkaifeck's reputation. A crime that could have been solved, but was not. The lack of closure has kept attention fixed not only on the horror of the murders, but also on the shadow cast by a missed investigation. And when official paths run dry, suspicion inevitably shifts onto human behavior, how survivors acted, who seemed too calm, who appeared too comfortable at the scene. Out of all those figures, one name drew attention again and again, returning with each retelling of the story. Suspicion in the wake of the killing settled on a man who lived just a few hundred meters from the Gruber farm, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His name gained prominence not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of how closely his life had woven into that of the victims. He had history with the family. He played a key role in discovering the bodies, and his conduct during those crucial first hours struck witnesses in ways that raised doubt about his innocence. On April 4th, when neighbors realized the Grubers had not been seen for days, Schlittenbauer organized the trip to investigate. Together with Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel, he made the short walk to Hinterkaifeck. His own sons had already been sent earlier to check, but had come back unsettled, reporting that the doors were locked and the farm eerily quiet. Now Lorenz took it upon himself to enter directly. Accounts note that he produced a key to the house, even though Victoria had reported a key missing before the murders. Using it, Lorenz crossed the threshold alone into the house and barn, actions that triggered as much suspicion as they did admiration for boldness. Once inside, his composure drew attention. Witnesses remarked that he moved through the rooms calmly, unshaken by what he found. In the barn, he helped uncover bodies from beneath hay. In the house, he stepped through rooms that others were reluctant even to approach. This practical steadiness might have reassured the fearful, but to some neighbors it looked unnatural, even suspicious. His knowledge of where to go and his lack of visible emotion struck them as behavior that did not match the shock of genuine discovery. That first impression would linger for decades. Further speculation circled around his connection to Victoria, the widowed daughter of the household. Many in the village believed that he and Victoria had been more than acquaintances, and some whispered that he was the real father of her 2-year-old son, Josef. Rumors said Lorenz once acknowledged the child, but later withdrew support, fueling arguments over paternity and responsibility. In a community already watchful of morality and inheritance, the prospect of an illegitimate child connected to him intensified scrutiny. If Josef was his, then unresolved questions over money, reputation, and obligation could have generated private conflicts hidden from public view. Such a possibility made a simple robbery less convincing to those who suspected Lorenz more deeply. It set the murders in the context of personal entanglements, family honor, scandal, or rejection, where motive and resentment could easily take root. Stories passed down in the village often framed him less as an outsider intruder and more as a man entangled in the intimate disputes of the victims themselves. Of course, suspicion required plausibility, and here contradictions appeared. Schlittenbauer had suffered war injuries and lived with asthma that left him short of breath. Neighbors found it unlikely that someone with such limitations could wield a heavy mattock with the determination required to kill 6 people, some of whom were young and able to resist. Investigators noted the stillness and control needed to strike, conceal bodies, and then carry on farm chores in the days after. To many, it seemed beyond his physical strength. Yet others countered that strength was not necessarily the determining factor. If Lorenz knew the Grubers well enough to lure them one by one into the barn under pretexts, perhaps checking on livestock, then the murders may not have required extended struggles. A single, sudden blow could incapacitate a victim before alarm spread. The ages of those killed, from a child to an elderly couple, did not suggest coordinated defense. Not tipped the balance for many was not theory, but demeanor. Testimonies describe him speaking about the bodies with a kind of detachment, sometimes moving them himself or pointing to details of the rooms as though leading others through the house. His confidence impressed some who wanted order in a frightening moment, but unsettled others who expected horror or hesitation. To their eyes, his behavior blurred the line between neighborly responsibility and something less defensible, the composure of someone already familiar with what lay inside. Authorities investigated him thoroughly in 1922 and the years after,
but never found grounds for charges. Lack of physical evidence, combined with the inconsistencies of witness recollection, left them with suspicion, but no proof. Still, gossip clung to his name, and he remained a topic in village talk long after official files had gone silent. The suspicions even outlived him. Lorenz pursued defamation suits against individuals who accused him outright of the crime and won some judgments, legally affirming his denial. But community opinion rarely follows court rulings, and the shadow of rumor continued to follow him. Over time, his role has come to epitomize the problem of Hinterkaifeck. Evidence was too thin to convict, but too suggestive to ignore. He had opportunity, knowledge, and possible motive in the form of family ties and personal disputes. He also had weaknesses, health limitations, and visible public exposure that made him an unlikely candidate for some. Depending on which side a storyteller favors, Lorenz becomes either the key suspect, overlooked by law, or a man wrongfully branded by circumstance.
That ambiguity is why his figure remains central in retellings even though no charge was ever brought. Neighbors remembered his calm entry into the farmhouse with the contested key. They whispered about his link to Victoria and Yosef. They measured his behavior in grief and found it not what they would have shown themselves. And through all of it, he stood before courts not as a criminal, but as a plaintiff, defending his name against accusation. In the end, the suspicion surrounding Lorenz Schlittenbauer illustrates how the murders could not be separated from the lives and bonds of those who lived around Hinterkaifeck. Was he the hidden perpetrator, or simply the most convenient target for community doubt? The records never resolved that question, and perhaps never will. What his case shows is how closely private relationships, grievances, and secrets became inseparable from the interpretation of the tragedy. And those same questions, about motives rooted in family, inheritance, and reputation, were not confined to one man. Beyond Lorenz, the silence of the farm fed wider theories, each searching for answers in different corners of the family's tangled history and the village's wary distance. What explains the murders at Hinterkaifeck? Were they the result of personal grudges, long-festering family secrets, or the actions of an intruder watching from the shadows? Without direct evidence, every explanation remains a theory, but each theory is anchored to fragments investigators and neighbors left behind. They form not answers, but pathways that continue to define how the case is remembered. One of the earliest explanations turned inward, to the Gruber household itself. The idea of incest wasn't just idle gossip. In 1915, both Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria had been convicted of incest, a fact preserved in public records. Although Andreas served a year in prison and Victoria only a month, the conviction never faded from local memory. For neighbors, it was one of many reasons the family stood apart. This history led investigators to ask whether shame, blackmail, or anger linked to that relationship might have triggered violence. If true, the motive would not have been theft or chance, but the exposure of hidden scandal and resentment within the family. Inheritance disputes were another possibility. The Gruber's land made them more secure than many households in Bavaria after World War I. Victoria was said to have deposited money in a Beichtstuhl fund, a kind of church-linked arrangement meant to safeguard her children's future. That gesture hinted at complicated questions. Who would control the property after Andreas? And would Victoria's children inherit directly? Arguments over land and legacy were often volatile in rural communities, where families relied on farms for survival. Even subtle shifts in ownership could divide relatives or provoke claims from outsiders who saw themselves as entitled heirs. At the center of dispute stood Victoria's young son, Yosef. Village talk tied his paternity to Lorenz Schlittenbauer,
the neighbor whose actions on April 4th drew so much suspicion. Some accounts said Lorenz acknowledged the boy, at least briefly, while others insisted he denied the child was his. If Yosef truly was Lorenz's son, his legal recognition and inheritance rights could unsettle property transfers, money, or personal reputation. That connection gave strength to theories that linked motive not to robbery, but to fraught relationships between neighbors and the Gruber household itself. Theories about a hidden outsider drew from stranger but still verifiable details. The footprints in the snow led in one direction, from the forest to the farm's machine house, with no return trail. Attic noises had been reported by both the family and their maids. And when police searched after the murders, they found hollows in the hayloft, as if someone had slept there. Human excrement among the straw, and roof tiles shifted aside in a way that gave a view down into the yard. These details formed the heart of the intruder theory, the possibility that someone lived undetected in the attic or barn loft for a time, moving about quietly and studying the family before deciding to act. Seen this way, months of unease and sounds in the rafters weren't superstition, but warnings that an intruder was already inside. Other theories traced motive to Andreas himself. He had a reputation in the village for being difficult, harsh toward neighbors, and quick to argue. In a tightly knit rural world, grudges could linger for years, sharpened by insults or disputes over property lines, livestock, or debt. To those who believed this path, the murders were a kind of private retribution, not random at all, but aimed at Andreas, with the elimination of his entire family serving as an act of total vengeance. Speculation about an unknown traveler also surfaced. The upheaval of post-war Germany left many people wandering. Some ex-soldiers turned drifters with little to lose. Into that climate, theories introduced the figure of a stranger who stumbled upon the farm, saw opportunity, and attacked. A robber, perhaps, or someone hardened by war. Yet investigators quickly cooled to this version. Robbery made little sense in light of what remained inside the house. Gold coins, paper money, and jewelry were untouched, still in drawers and obvious places. Investigators abandoned robbery as a motive precisely because valuables in plain sight had not been taken. The killings looked deliberate and personal, not the impulsive act of a vagrant. More recently, one outsider theory connected Hinterkaifeck to wider crimes. In the 2017 book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James compared early 20th century axe murders across Europe and America, speculating whether a single itinerant killer named Paul Mueller could be responsible. They acknowledged Hinterkaifeck fit some of the hallmarks, but ultimately rated it as a toss-up, not a proven match. Even proponents of this long-distance theory recognize that local ties and personal conflicts may better explain Hinterkaifeck than the arrival of a serial killer from abroad. One of the most persistent but least supported theories was that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, returned to commit the murders. He had been killed in 1914 during the First World War, and his identity was verified by fellow soldiers. Still, whispers in the village resurrected his name, especially when the brutality of the crime demanded an explanation. Historians caution that military records and later identifications confirm his death, making the suggestion he returned highly unlikely. The endurance of this story shows how suspicion generated myths where answers could not be found. Modern attempts to weigh the evidence, including the 2007 Student Review of Police Records, come back to one clear thread. Later reviews generally favored a personal or emotional motive over robbery or random violence. The fact that valuables were left untouched, coupled with the methodical elimination of the entire household, pointed towards something intimate, anger or resentment shaped by relationships rather than opportunistic crime. Yet the inability to identify a specific individual means no consensus has hardened into proof. That is the recurring pattern across a century of speculation. Each theory takes on weight when viewed through a particular detail. Incest convictions, inheritance deposits, footprints without return tracks, excrement in the loft, valuables left behind. Each suggests motive, but none connects motive directly to an identified hand. Instead, the case turns like a prism, different facets reflecting different versions of how the murders might be understood. And this is where the shadows of Hinterkaifeck remain strongest. The physical farmhouse is gone, demolished with only foundations left. Records hold fragments, and neighbors' recollections pass through the distortions of rumor. What endures is the unease, the sense that fear had already settled into the Gruber household before the murders themselves. That unease continues to shape how people look upon the case today, not just as a crime unsolved, but as a silence that deepened long before the strikes of a weapon in the dark.
The tragedy of Hinterkaifeck lies not only in the murders themselves, but in the warnings that seemed to precede them. Footsteps found in the snow, movements heard in the attic, and a maid resigning in fear pointed to danger that no one acted upon. To investigators and neighbors, these details later stood out as evidence that unease inside the farmhouse had already reached a breaking point. What followed was an investigation that never solved the case. Files were eventually closed in 1955, even though interrogations of suspects continued as late as 1986. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, and today a simple memorial marks the site where the Gruber family once lived. Which theory convinces you? Tell us in the comments.